The first thing Grace noticed was that no one had touched her cup. It had been sitting on the edge of the long oak table for nearly an hour, filled with dark elderberry wine, untouched, slowly losing its warmth the way she had slowly lost any expectation that this night would be different from any other. Around her, the great hall of Ashvale Pack roared with sound. Laughter crashed against the stone walls. Boot heels struck the wooden floor in rhythm with the drums. The scent of roasted meat and pine resin drifted thick through the air, mixing with candle smoke and the sharp musk of wolf. It was the harvest gathering, the one night each year when every pack in the Northern Territory sent representatives to the Ashvale stronghold, and the one night each year when Grace remembered, with painful precision, exactly where she stood among her kind. Nowhere. She pressed her back against the cold stone pillar behind her and watched the hall fill with motion. The women of higher rank wore deep-dyed wool and silver pins in their braided hair. The men moved with the easy confidence of those who had never once questioned whether they belonged. Couples drifted toward the open floor at the center of the hall as the musicians settled into a slower tune, a courtship melody, traditional and unmistakable. Grace recognized it immediately. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her cup. She was 24 years old. She had attended this gathering every year since she was old enough to stand without her mother's hand. And not once, not a single time, had anyone asked her to dance. It was not for lack of trying. In her younger years, she had worn her best dress, had let her golden hair fall loose over her shoulders, had smiled at men who looked past her as though she were made of smoke. The problem was not her face, or her dress, or the way she smiled. The problem was the word that followed her name like a shadow sewn to her feet. Omega. The lowest rank in the pack hierarchy. Weak in wolf form, minimal in strength, negligible in status. Omegas were tolerated, sometimes pitied, occasionally useful, but they were not chosen, not in public, not at gatherings where every choice was watched and weighed and remembered. No man with ambition, with rank, with even the modest dignity of a mid-tier wolf, would risk the silent judgment of his peers by crossing the floor toward an Omega. Grace had learned this lesson young. She had simply stopped expecting otherwise. She took a small sip of wine and let her gaze drift across the hall. Near the fire, she spotted Dina, the pack healer's daughter, spinning, laughing in the arms of a broad-shouldered beta. Near the far wall, two of the visiting wolves from the Ironwood territory were arguing good-naturedly over whose pack made better mead. At the high table, the Ashvale Alpha, a thick-necked man named Gorin, sat talking with his counsel, paying no attention to the dancing floor below. And at the edge of the courtship circle, Grace noticed something that made her chest tighten without warning. 3 men stood together near the musicians. Young, all of similar rank, all looking directly at her. She recognized 2 of them. Bren, who worked the eastern stables, and Austin, the blacksmith's second son. They were laughing. Not at anything being said, she realized. At her. One of them made a gesture, a small, dismissive flick of the wrist in her direction, and the others laughed harder. Grace looked away. She had taught herself not to let it show. The stillness was armor. She kept her spine straight, her chin level, her expression composed into something she hoped read as indifference. Inside, the feeling was an old one, dull and familiar, like pressing a thumb against a bruise. She did not cry. She had not cried about this in years. She simply absorbed it, quietly, the way water absorbs cold. What she wanted was to leave. What she did instead was stay, because leaving early would be noticed, and being noticed for leaving early was somehow worse than being noticed for nothing at all. The music shifted again. A faster melody. More couples joined the floor. The hall grew louder, warmer. The candle flames along the walls guttered in the draft from the open upper windows, sending shadows dancing across the tapestries. Old woven things depicting wolf hunts and moonrise ceremonies and the founding of the northern packs. Grace had always liked those tapestries. She had spent many harvest gatherings studying their stitched details rather than watching the floor. She was tracing the outline of a stitched wolf mid-leap when she felt it. A shift in the hall's atmosphere. Not a sound. Precisely. More like a change in pressure. The way the air thickens before a storm breaks. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered. Laughter softened. The musicians played on, but even they seemed to tighten slightly, as though the tune required more concentration than it had a moment ago. Grace's gaze moved instinctively toward the hall's main entrance. The doors were open. They had been open all evening. But now, filling the space between them, stood a group of men she did not recognize. 8, perhaps 10, all armored in dark leather and carrying themselves with the rigid posture of soldiers who were never off duty. They wore no pack colors she could name. Their cloaks were black, with a faint silver edging. They entered without announcement, spreading slightly as they crossed the threshold, making space for the man who walked behind them. He was taller than any of them, broader at the shoulder. He wore black leather armor with crossing straps at the chest and thick gauntlets at his wrists, and around his shoulders hung a heavy pelt that swayed as he moved. His hair was dark, braided close at the sides and falling in thick twists past his jaw, and his eyes, even from across the hall, even through the distance and the candlelight, were pale and sharp. There was a scar across his cheekbone. A small one, fine as a thread, but visible. Grace did not know his name, but she understood, without being told, exactly what he was. Every alpha in the room felt it. She watched Goran straighten at the high table, watched the conversation drain from his face, watched the men near the fire go still, watched the women at the edges of the room turn their heads, with expressions caught somewhere between fascination and caution. An Alpha King did not need an introduction. His presence was the introduction. The hall received him the way a held breath receives the moment before it releases, with a kind of suspended, trembling attention. He moved through the space without hurry, his guards falling back to the walls as he walked, leaving him alone in the center of the room. His gaze swept the hall once, a slow, assessing circuit, the way a man surveys land he is deciding whether to cross. And then, impossibly, his gaze stopped. Grace felt it before she processed it. A specific quality of attention, different from the ambient noise of the room. She glanced up. She had looked away. She had been studying the floor, and found that the man with the pale eyes and the black pelt was looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her. At her. Her breath caught in a way she could not explain and did not have time to examine, because in the next moment he changed direction, away from the high table, away from Goran and the council who were clearly waiting to receive him, and began walking, with the same unhurried certainty, directly toward the stone pillar where she stood alone with her untouched cup of cooling wine. The hall went very quiet. Grace did not move. She was not sure she could. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell cold night air still clinging to his armor, and beneath it something like pine resin and iron. His expression was not warm, exactly. It was still and serious, and completely unreadable. He looked at her for one long moment, and then he extended his hand, palm up, open, unhurried, the same gesture any man makes when asking a woman to dance, and said nothing, only waited. Grace stared at his hand, then at his face, then at his hand again. Around them, the silence had weight. She did not understand what was happening. She did not understand why. But she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has spent years learning to read a room, that every single person in that hall was watching, and that whatever she did next would change something. She just didn't yet know what. Grace took his hand. She was not sure it was a decision exactly. It felt more like gravity, the kind of pull that doesn't ask permission. Her fingers settled against his palm, and she was immediately aware of how cold her hand was compared to the dry, steady warmth of his. His grip was firm but not tight. He did not yank her forward or make her stumble. He simply closed his fingers around hers with the quiet certainty of someone who had never once in his life needed to demand anything, because the world had always arranged itself around his presence without being asked. He led her to the floor. The musicians hesitated for only a breath before finding their rhythm again, a slower tune than before, something low and deliberate, the kind of melody that filled a room without rushing it. The other couples on the floor drifted back instinctively, opening a wide circle around them, and Grace felt the attention of the entire hall like a physical pressure against her skin. She had imagined being on this floor many times. In those imaginings, it had felt like relief, like belonging. This felt nothing like that. This felt like standing at the edge of something very high. His hand settled at her waist, proper, measured, not too close, and he began to move, and she followed because there was nothing else to do. She was a passable dancer. She had practiced alone in the small room behind the Pack's herb stores, where no one would see, turning slow circles with her arms held out to an invisible partner. The steps came back to her now through muscle memory, and she was grateful for that, because her mind was producing very little of practical use. "You look like you're waiting for something to go wrong," he said. His voice was low, not unkind, but direct, the way a man speaks when he has no patience for anything that isn't honest. Grace kept her eyes at the level of his collarbone. "Isn't it?" A pause. "Is that a question or a statement?" "I don't know yet." She felt, rather than saw, something shift in his expression. Not a smile. She wasn't sure this man smiled easily, but a slight easing around the jaw that suggested the answer had not displeased him. "Xander," he said. She looked up then. "I know who you are." "Then you have the advantage." "I don't know who you are." Grace held his gaze for a moment. Those pale eyes were disconcerting up close. Not cold, precisely, but unbothered by things that bothered other people, the way deep water is unbothered by surface wind. "Grace," she said, "I'm no one important. You're someone who was standing alone at a wall while every man in this hall was too much of a coward to cross the floor." His tone didn't shift. He said it the way someone states a direction on a map. "That makes you notable, at minimum." The heat that moved up the back of her neck was not entirely embarrassment. Part of it was something more complicated, the specific discomfort of being seen clearly by someone you have only just met. She had spent years cultivating careful invisibility, and this man had dissolved it in approximately 30 seconds without appearing to try. "They didn't cross the floor because I'm an Omega," she said. She kept her voice flat. She was not asking for his pity, and she wanted him to understand that. "I know what you are." "Then you know why they didn't." "I know why they told themselves they didn't." His hand at her waist shifted slightly as he guided them through a turn. "Fear dressed as reason. I've seen it in war councils and throne rooms. It looks the same in a village hall." Grace didn't answer. She wasn't sure what to do with a man who said things like that, who spoke about her situation not with sympathy or dismissal, but with the blunt assessment of someone examining a tactical failure. It left her with no familiar script to follow. At the edges of the floor, she was aware of the watching. She could feel Goran's gaze from the high table, heavy and calculating, the stare of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the evening. She could feel the stares of Bren and Austin near the musicians, their laughter gone, replaced by something less comfortable. She could feel the women watching with expressions she couldn't entirely read. Some curious, some envious, some simply stunned. And she could feel, from somewhere much closer, a different kind of attention. It came from the left side of the hall, near the second pillar from the entrance. She glanced in that direction without meaning to, and found a man watching her, not with the open curiosity of the crowd, but with something narrower and more deliberate. He was lean, dark-haired, perhaps 30, wearing the silver-edged black of Xander's guard. But he was not watching Xander. He was watching her, specifically, with an expression that she could only describe as assessment, as though he were deciding what she was worth. She looked away before he could catch her staring. "One of your men is watching me," she said quietly. Xander didn't look. "Which one?" "Second pillar, dark hair, lean, not smiling." A beat of silence. "Rafe, my second." Something in his voice was difficult to read. "He watches everyone I interact with. It's his function. He looks like he's deciding something." "He's always deciding something." This time there was something beneath the words. Not warmth, exactly, but the layered familiarity of two people who have known each other long enough that even tension becomes a kind of shorthand. "Ignore him." Grace was not sure she could, but she nodded. The music slowed toward its end. She became aware that the dance was almost over and felt, absurdly, something close to reluctance. Not because of him, she told herself, but because the moment it ended she would be returned to the wall, to the pillar, to the untouched cup, and the hall would close back around her like water over a stone. "Why did you do this?" she asked. The question came out quieter than she intended. He looked down at her. The candlelight caught the scar on his cheekbone, that fine pale line, old and long healed. "Because I wanted to. Alpha Kings don't want things without reasons." "That's not true. We want things constantly. We simply choose carefully which wants we act on." He held her gaze with an evenness that she found unsettling and oddly steadying at the same time. "You were standing alone. I chose to act." "That's not a reason. That's a description." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "You're sharper than you pretend to be." "I don't pretend anything." "No," he said, and his voice had shifted. Something quieter in it, something she could not name. "I don't think you do." The last note of the music fell away. They stopped moving. He released her hand with the same measured care with which he had taken it, and stepped back, and the circle of watching eyes pressed inward again, filling the space between them with the noise and breath of the hall. Grace stood very still. She felt strange, not in a bad way, but in the way of something rearranged, a room where the furniture has been moved slightly and the familiar light falls differently now. She became aware of Goran moving from the high table, descending toward them with a broad, overmanaged smile, and the body language of a man approaching a situation he does not control, and deeply wishes he did. Several of his counsel followed, and at the second pillar, Rafe had not moved. His gaze had shifted from Grace to Xander and back again, and the expression on his face had settled into something that was not hostility, but was close enough to its border that Grace noted it carefully. She filed it away. She did not know yet what it meant. What she knew was this: she had come to the harvest gathering expecting nothing. She had stood at her wall and swallowed the old familiar ache of being overlooked, and she had prepared, as she always did, to walk home through the cold dark alone. Instead, the most powerful man in the Northern Territory had crossed a crowded room to take her hand. And the night, she understood with a low, uncertain feeling in her chest, was not over. Goran reached them before Grace had time to step away. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with a thick red-brown beard, and the kind of smile that showed too many teeth, and not enough of anything real. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to enter conversations he hadn't been invited to, and he arrived at Xander's side with his hand already extended and his voice already warm, as though he had simply been delayed in greeting an expected guest, rather than caught off guard by one. "My king." He dipped his head. Not quite a bull, not quite not one either. "We weren't informed of your arrival. The honor is unexpected." "Intentionally," Xander said. He shook the offered hand once, briefly. "I prefer to see a pack as it is." Something moved behind Goran's eyes. A flicker of calculation quickly smoothed over. "Of course. And what you see, I hope, reflects well on Asheville. I'm still deciding. Goran's smile held, but only at the surface. He let his gaze slide sideways to Grace with the specific quality of a man noticing an inconvenient detail. I see you've met one of our pack members. The pause before he finished the sentence was very small. Grace heard it anyway. Grace, Xander said, without looking at Goran. Her name is Grace. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of Goran's mouth. Yes, of course. He looked at her directly then, and she recognized the look. It was the one that meant you are temporarily elevated by borrowed importance, and we will both remember that when this man leaves. She had received variations of that look her entire life. Grace, I hope you've made our guest feel welcome. She was the most honest person I've spoken to this evening, Xander said. His tone remained level. That is its own form of welcome. Goran laughed, a short, polished sound. Well, we're glad to hear it. He steered the conversation then, gently and firmly, the way a man steers a boat away from rocks, toward matters of territory and the reason for the king's visit, and whether he would require lodging at the stronghold. Xander answered in short, complete sentences and allowed himself to be steered, and Grace recognized the moment when her presence was no longer the center of anything. She took a quiet step backward, and then another. She was nearly to the edge of the crowd when a hand closed around her arm. Not hard, not frightening, but deliberate. She turned. Rafe stood beside her. Up close, he was younger than she had estimated from across the room, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with dark eyes that moved quickly, and a jaw set with the permanent tension of someone who spent most of his time being careful. He was not smiling. "Walk with me," he said, not a question. Grace looked at his hand on her arm. He released it immediately. She gave him credit for that, but held her gaze with an expectation that suggested he was used to being obliged. "I don't know you," she said. "No. But you noticed me, which means you're observant, and you danced with the king without tripping over your own feet or saying something foolish, which means you're composed." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to understand what else you are." She studied him for a moment. The noise of the hall continued around them. Laughter, music resuming, Goran's voice rising and falling with diplomatic smoothness somewhere behind her. Rafe waited with the patience of someone who was genuinely prepared to stand there indefinitely. "One circle of the hall," she said. "Then I'm going home." He nodded once and fell into step beside her. They moved along the perimeter, past the tapestries and the wall-mounted torches, and the groups of wolves who tracked them with their eyes as they passed. Grace kept her hands folded in front of her, and her pace steady. "How long have you known him?" Rafe asked. "I met him 20 minutes ago." "And before that? Had you heard of him?" "Everyone's heard of the Alpha King." "That's not what I asked." He glanced at her sidelong. "Had you specifically sought out information about him? About his movements? About this gathering?" Grace stopped walking. She turned to face him directly, and she let the politeness drop from her expression because she was tired, and the evening had already taken more from her than she had expected to give. "Say what you mean," she said quietly. "I'm not a courtier. I don't have the patience for sideways questions." Rafe looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way a blade is turned to a different angle rather than sheathed. "Someone told us this gathering would be used to pass information to a rival faction. A contact within Ashevale Pack, feeding intelligence about the king's border movements to a lord named Saval in the eastern lowlands." He watched her face as he spoke. The contact is described as a woman with light hair and low rank, someone easily overlooked. The silence between them had a different quality now. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not guilt, but the specific chill of understanding something unpleasant. You think it's me. I thought it might be you. Before. He paused. I'm less certain now. Because I danced with him. Because of how you danced with him. He said it simply, without apology. A woman running a deception wouldn't have looked that surprised. You didn't know he was going to approach you. That reaction was real. Grace breathed slowly. I am not a spy, she said. I have no connection to anyone named Saval. I barely have connections within my own pack. She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to disguise it. I'm an Omega, Rafe. I know things about being invisible, but I don't use it for politics. I use it to survive. The words landed in the space between them. Rafe looked at her steadily. In the firelight, she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. Not tiredness from the evening, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from too many months of vigilance without rest. I believe you, he said finally. You don't have to tell me that. No, but I'm telling you anyway. Because what I said was unfair, and you deserve to know I know that. He looked away toward the hall, toward the spot where Xander still stood with Goran and the council, his dark braided head visible above the crowd. He does things like that, you know. Crosses rooms for people no one else is crossing rooms for. He notices things that are wrong and he corrects them, even when there's no strategic reason to. A pause. It makes my job considerably harder. Despite herself, despite everything, Grace felt the edge of something almost like a smile. That sounds frustrating. It is. He glanced back at her, and for the first time his expression carried something warmer than assessment. It's also why I've followed him for 6 years without question. He said it plainly, as a fact rather than a declaration. The woman you should be looking at is not you. It's the pack healer's daughter. Grace went very still. Dina. She's been at the eastern window 3 times this evening. Not to look at the courtyard, to look at who is coming and going through the side gate. He said it quietly, for her ears only. I may be wrong, but I've been right about these things before. He excused himself then with a small nod, not unfriendly, and moved back into the crowd, and Grace was left standing alone beside an old tapestry of a silver wolf mid-run, with the sound of the hall pressing in around her, and a feeling in her chest that was part unease and part something she couldn't yet name. She looked across the room. Xander was still with Goran, but his gaze had drifted just briefly over the heads of the crowd, and found her, the way it had found her when he first entered, with that same quiet precision. He held it for only a moment. Then he returned his attention to Goran. But that moment was enough to confirm what Grace was already reluctantly beginning to understand. The harvest gathering had ended. Something else had started. And tomorrow, she suspected, would not look like any tomorrow she had prepared for. She did not sleep. The room she kept at the edge of the pack's communal longhouse was small, barely wide enough for a narrow cot, a wooden chest, and a shelf where she kept her dried herbs and the small clay pot she used for brewing morning tea. The single window faced north, and in winter the wind found its way through the gaps in the frame, no matter how much dried moss she pressed into the cracks. She lay on her back with her wool blanket pulled to her chin and listened to the wind move across the rooftop and thought about Dina. Dina, who had danced all evening with that broad-shouldered beta, who had laughed at the right moments and refilled her cup at the right intervals and done everything a young woman does at a harvest gathering when she wants to be remembered as having simply been present. Dina, whose father was the pack healer, which meant Dina had access to the healing stores. And the healing stores sat adjacent to the room where Goran's council kept their correspondence. Grace had known this for years. She had simply never had cause to think about it. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes and exhaled slowly. It was possible Rafe was wrong. He had said so himself. He was a man whose profession was suspicion, which meant he saw threat-shaped shadows in ordinary corners. It was possible Dina had simply been warm and wanted air, 3 separate times, at a window that happened to face the side gate. It was also possible that Grace was lying here at the coldest hour of the night, working very hard to find a reason not to trust the instinct that had flickered awake the moment Rafe had said the words, light hair and low rank. Because those words described Dina just as precisely as they described herself. And the difference between them was only that Dana smiled at the right people, and Grace had long since stopped trying. She rose before dawn. The longhouse was silent. She pulled on her linen dress and her wool stockings and laced her boots by feel in the dark, then took her gray cloak from the hook beside the door and stepped out into the morning. The cold hit her immediately, a sharp, clean cold with no wind behind it, the kind that comes just before the sky decides what it is going to do. The ground was hard underfoot, frost pale in the gray pre-dawn light. She could see her breath. She walked with her arms crossed under her cloak and her head down, following the familiar path toward the herb store at the back of the longhouse. She smelled the smoke before she saw the source. It was coming from the direction of the small records room, the one that shared a wall with the healing stores, the one that held the correspondence. Not the smoke of a morning fire lit for warmth. This was different, sharper. The specific, acrid bite of parchment, burning. Grace stopped walking. Her mind moved quickly through what this meant, and arrived at a conclusion she did not want. Someone was destroying documents, before the king's men had a chance to examine them in daylight. She changed direction without allowing herself to think about whether it was wise. The side door of the records room was unlatched. She pushed it open, and the smell rolled over her, hot and bitter. The inside of the small room illuminated by the orange flutter of burning papers in the iron brazier in the corner. And crouched beside the brazier, feeding a folded document into the coals with quick, practiced movements, was Dina. She looked up the moment Grace entered. For one suspended second they simply looked at each other. Dina's face was flushed from the heat, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her expression moving rapidly through a series of calculations that Grace could track, because she had spent her entire life learning to read the faces of people deciding how much to admit. "Grace," Dina said. Her voice was steady. That steadiness itself was a tell. "What are you burning?" "Old inventory lists. My father asked me to clear the records before the new season." She said it smoothly. The answer was ready. Had been ready, Grace suspected, before she even entered the room. Before dawn, in the records room, not the healing stores. Dina's jaw tightened fractionally. "The brazier in the stores is blocked. Does it matter?" Grace looked at the brazier. The edge of a document was still visible at the coal's edge, and on it, before the fire finished its work, she could see the top portion of a seal she did not recognize. Not Ashvale's wolf's head. Something else. Something with an angular border she thought she had seen once on a trade document from the eastern lowlands. She looked back at Dina. "It does matter," Grace said quietly. What happened next happened quickly. Dina rose from her crouch, and her expression dropped the pretense entirely. Not into panic, but into something colder and more deliberate, which was worse. She crossed the small room in 2 steps, and took Grace by the front of her cloak with both hands, and the grip was strong, far stronger than Grace had expected. "You are going to walk back to your room," Dina said, low and even. "And you are going to say nothing, because no one will believe you. You know that. You have always known that." Her eyes were dark and very calm. "You are an Omega who danced once with a powerful man. By tomorrow he'll be gone, and you'll be exactly what you were yesterday. No rank, no voice, no standing. Who would take your word over mine?" Grace did not move. She held Dina's gaze and let the words land without flinching, because flinching would give Dina something to work with. Inside, the words did their damage. Old damage, along old lines, finding the familiar grooves. But she had spent 24 years learning the difference between a thing that hurt and a thing that was true. "Let go of my cloak," she said, Grace, let go. Dina released her, stepped back. Her composure was returning already, smoothing itself back into place. Think carefully, she said, about what this costs you. Grace straightened her cloak. She looked once more at the brazier, at the ashes of whatever had been in those documents, at the faint residue of that Eastern seal. Then she walked out of the records room and into the cold morning air. She did not go back to her room. She turned instead toward the far side of the stronghold, toward the guest quarters where Xander's black-cloaked guards had been stationed the night before. She walked quickly, her boots silent on the frosted ground, her cloak pulled close. The sky was beginning to lighten at the far eastern edge, a thin seam of pale gray above the tree line. She found Rafe outside the guest house door. He was awake. Of course he was awake. She suspected this man was always awake. Standing with a cup of something steaming and his gaze on the middle distance, already wearing his full armor as though the night had never suggested anything as vulnerable as sleep. He saw her coming and straightened slightly. "Dina," Grace said when she was close enough. "Records room, east wall brazier. She's been burning documents with a seal I don't know. Angular border, Eastern lowlands style. She had them ready. She knew to do it before daylight." Rafe set down his cup. "You're certain?" "I saw the seal before it finished burning, and I saw her face when she told me no one would believe me." Grace held his gaze. Her voice was steady. She wasn't afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of being late. For one moment, Rafe was entirely still. Then he turned and pushed open the guest house door without knocking. Grace stood in the cold and listened to the sounds of movement inside. Quick, purposeful, the particular organized urgency of men who have drilled for exactly this kind of morning. Within minutes, 2 of the guards emerged and moved at a sharp pace toward the records room. Rafe reappeared in the doorway. Behind him, pulling on his leather gauntlet with calm, unhurried movements, was Xander. He stepped outside. The pale morning light caught the planes of his face, the scar, the dark braids, those gray-blue eyes that found her immediately. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." And something in Grace, something that had been braced for most of her life against the specific disappointment of not being taken seriously, quietly, carefully, like a fist slowly opening, released. She told him everything. They stood in the cold morning air beside the guest house wall, and Grace spoke in a low, careful voice. The dance, Rafe's warning, the sleepless hours, the smell of smoke before dawn, the burning seal, Dina's grip on her cloak, and the words she had used with the particular confidence of someone who had said similar things before and found them effective. Xander listened without interrupting. He did not pace or cross his arms or make the small, impatient sounds that men make when they are waiting for someone to arrive at a point. He simply listened, his gaze steady on her face, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is not deciding whether to believe her, but rather deciding what to do with what he already believes. "How long has Dina had access to the council records?" he asked. "Years. Her father's stores share the wall. No one would have questioned her presence in that corridor." "And Goran?" Grace hesitated. "I don't know if Goran is involved, but I know he benefits from keeping low-ranking pack members quiet and manageable. If Dina was feeding information to Saval, someone with authority in this pack made it easy for her to do it. Whether deliberately or through carelessness, I can't say." Xander turned his gaze toward the stronghold. In the early light, the stone walls looked gray and heavy, smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimneys as the pack stirred toward morning. His expression was difficult to read, not cold, but contained, the way a banked fire is contained. "Saval has been pressuring 3 border packs to withdraw their loyalty pledges," he said, and Grace understood that he was telling her something he did not tell everyone. The understanding of that settled in her chest with a quiet weight. "If he had access to my movement records, my patrol schedules, He would know exactly where the gaps are, where to apply pressure, where to send men if he wanted to move without meeting resistance. Have any packs withdrawn? Not yet. He looked back at her. Because of last night. She held his gaze. You came to see if the rumors were true, about a contact here. I came to see what Ashevale was, without the performance. A pause. I found more than I expected. Grace looked down at her boots on the frosted ground. The morning was growing lighter by degrees. The gray seam at the horizon widening, birds beginning their first tentative sounds in the pine trees beyond the stronghold wall. She thought about what Dina had said. By tomorrow he'll be gone, and you'll be exactly what you were yesterday. She had been thinking about that sentence since she walked out of the records room, turning it over, examining it for truth. It was partially true. Xander would leave. That was the nature of kings. They passed through, they assessed. They made decisions that rearranged other people's lives and then continued on to the next arrangement. She did not have the luxury of believing last night was anything other than what it was. A man with a powerful instinct for justice crossing a floor because something was wrong. Not because she was remarkable. But the second part, you'll be exactly what you were. That part she was less certain of. Because she had walked across a frozen courtyard before dawn to report what she had seen, and she had done it knowing Dina's words might be right, knowing she might be dismissed, knowing the outcome might cost her the only marginal piece she had managed to build inside Ashevale Pack. She had done it anyway. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only thing she was fully certain of this morning. The guards returned from the records room. One of them spoke to Rafe in a low voice. Rafe turned to Xander. Brazier's still warm. Most of it is ash. But she didn't finish. 2 documents survived in the bottom of the pile. She ran out of time. He glanced at Grace with an expression that was not quite an apology, and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere between the two. Eastern Seal. Sival's personal mark. The stillness that moved through Xander was very different from ordinary stillness. It was the kind that precedes action. A drawn breath held. A weight shifted forward. Bring Goran, he said, and find the girl. What followed was the kind of morning that Grace had never been part of and had never expected to be. Xander's men moved through the stronghold with quiet efficiency, waking no one who didn't need to be woken, disturbing nothing that didn't need to be disturbed. Goran was found in his hall already dressed, which itself said something, and brought to the room Xander had commandeered as a meeting space, a plainly furnished chamber off the main corridor that smelled of old timber and tallow. Grace remained in the corridor. She had not been asked to leave, but she had not been asked to stay either. She stayed. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall and listened to the muffled voices inside. Goran's at first too loud, then rapidly recalibrating into something more careful, and Xander's beneath it, steady and low, asking questions that had no comfortable answers. Dina was found at the east gate. She had a saddlebag. She had not quite managed to leave. When they brought her through the corridor, she passed close to Grace, and for a moment, their eyes met. Dina's face had lost all its social smoothness. What remained underneath was younger-looking and frightened, and something that surprised Grace despite everything, which was a complicated exhaustion, as though she had been holding something heavy for a very long time, and had simply dropped it. Grace did not feel triumph. She felt something sadder and more shapeless than that. The meetings lasted through the morning. Grace sat eventually on a wooden bench in the corridor, and someone, one of Xander's younger guards, a broad-faced boy who moved with the earnest efficiency of someone recently promoted, brought her a heel of bread and a cup of hot broth without being asked, and she ate it gratefully with her cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. At midday, Goran was relieved of his position as Ashevale Alpha. Not with ceremony, not with drama. Xander simply informed him, in the same level tone he used for everything, that the Crown would appoint an interim overseer while a formal review of Ashvale's leadership was conducted, and that Goran's cooperation in that review would be noted in whatever determination followed. Goran accepted this with the particular deflation of a man who had been calculating escape routes since dawn and had found them all closed. Dina's situation was handled separately. She was young. The documents she had passed were significant, but the damage was not yet irreversible. Seval had the information but had not yet acted on it, and with the source now gone quiet, the tactical value would decay quickly. Rafe explained this to Grace afterward, standing in the doorway of the timber room with his arms crossed and his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man delivering a complicated verdict. Dina would face consequences, but measured ones. She would not be destroyed for a mistake made in the service of someone who had used her ambition against her. She wanted out of this pack, Rafe said. Seval offered her a path. People do terrible things when they believe there is no other door. Grace thought of herself, standing at a wall with an untouched cup of wine. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The king wants to speak with you before we ride. She found Xander in the small courtyard behind the guest house, standing alone for what appeared to be one of the rare moments his role permitted it. He had removed the heavy fur mantle. Without it, he looked slightly less like a legend and slightly more like a man who had been awake since before dawn dealing with other people's failures. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the stone. You should have rank, he said. No preamble. Grace stopped. I'm sorry? What you did this morning required more courage than anything I witnessed from anyone of standing in this pack. The system that calls you low-ranked is measuring the wrong things. He held her gaze with that characteristic steadiness. I'm not able to change what you are by birth, but I can change what you are by designation. I'm offering you a formal position, attaché to the Crown's Northern Review. You would have standing, a stipend, and the authority to speak in assessments like this one. The world was very quiet for a moment. The pine trees beyond the wall moved slightly in a breeze she couldn't feel in the courtyard. Somewhere a horse shifted in its stall. Why? She asked. Because she was, as he had noted, not someone who pretended. Because I need people around me who tell the truth when it costs them something. He said it plainly. And because last night, every man in that hall failed a simple test of character, you passed one considerably harder this morning. Those things should have consequences. Good ones. Grace looked at him for a long time. She thought about the small room with the northern window and the cracked frame she packed with dried moss every winter. She thought about years of standing at walls. She thought about Dina's words, "You'll be exactly what you were," and understood, finally and completely, that Dina had been wrong. Not because of Xander. Because of what Grace herself had chosen to do in the cold gray hour before anyone was watching. She had walked across that courtyard. She had spoken the truth. She had not waited to be believed before deciding the truth was worth telling. All right, she said. Xander nodded once, not with triumph or warmth, but with the solid, final quality of a thing decided and recorded. Then something shifted in his expression. That almost movement at the corner of his mouth, the one she had seen once before on the dance floor. And for a moment he looked at her with something simple and unguarded. You should know, he said, that Rafe spent approximately 45 minutes this morning telling me you were the most logical candidate for the contact, and then approximately 40 minutes arguing that you were not, and then 5 minutes admitting he had been wrong from the beginning. A pause. He rarely admits that. He told me he believed me, Grace said. He told you. He argued with me anyway, because that is his nature. There was something in Xander's voice when he spoke of Rafe, that same layered, complicated familiarity she had heard the night before. Tension and trust braided together so tightly they had become indistinguishable. He will not admit it, but you impressed him. That is also rare. Grace felt the edge of a real smile, Not the polite, careful expression she had worn for years at gatherings, but something more honest. "I'll try not to let it go to my head." He left with his men an hour later. Grace stood at the stronghold gate and watched the black-cloaked column move down the road toward the tree line. Horses breathing white into the cold air, harness leather creaking. Rafe rode at Xander's right hand. He did not look back. Xander did, once, briefly, at the point where the road bent toward the pines. Not a wave, just a look. The acknowledgement of one person who has seen another clearly. Then he was gone into the trees. Grace stood at the gate for a moment longer. The cold settled back around her, familiar and clean. Behind her, the stronghold was beginning its midday sounds, fires being stoked, voices crossing the yard, the rhythmic knock of someone at a woodpile. Life continuing, reshaping itself around the morning's events, the way water reshapes around a stone dropped into it. She thought. Tomorrow she would send word to the Crown's Office of Review, confirming her acceptance. She would pack the wooden chest. It would not take long. She had never accumulated much. She would leave the cracked window and the dried moss and the small shelf of herbs. She thought. She would not miss being invisible. She had never liked it. She had simply been good at it because it was required. She turned back toward the stronghold. Her boots were steady on the stone. Her shoulders were straight. The woman who had stood at a wall with an untouched cup of wine, practicing invisibility, waiting to be overlooked. She was still Grace. She would always be Grace. But she was not any longer waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, she walked through a door without checking first whether she was allowed.